You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I have Sam Jacobs as my guest. He's been doing some writing at the Libertarian Institute, but his main website is ammo.com. He is the lead writer and chief historian there. And the work at ammo.com, Resistance Liberty, has been featured by USA Today, Reason, Bloomberg, Business Week, Zero Hedge, and The Guardian. So a lot of great stuff going on there. It says here you grew up in New England, but now you've traveled the world and trying to get off, I guess the main part of the grid here in the U.S. So welcome to the show. I'm excited to talk to you today because I think we got a real important subject, and that is the dark history of the ATF.
Thanks for having me on, man.
All right. Well, you wrote this article here at the Libertarian Institute that is a initial reason that I emailed you, because I think that the Fast and Furious scandal is something that kind of got lost in the early days of the Obama administration. It was like too political. This was probably the first real scandal the Republicans came across after the whole fake birth certificate thing that Donald Trump pushed. So, I think it probably got dismissed as being too partisan and stuff like that. Oh, you're attacking the first black president and his black attorney general and stuff like that was the tagline from the Democrats. But there was a real scandal here. So, you say this started under the Bush administration, actually, though. So can we talk at first some of the origins here of Fast and Furious?
Yeah, so this is Operation Fast and Furious is actually just kind of the name that people use for a number of different scandals that are all related to a practice that was called gun walking. So basically what gun walking is that if the ATF is tracking a bigger fish, they let guns walk, illegally purchased or suspicious purchases walk. So they, if they see a bunch of sketchy or questionable firearms purchases, they don't necessarily bust the guy who made them. They just kind of keep their eye on him, and they're trying to see where the weapons eventually end up. But if you know anything about either the history of the ATF or just the kind of incompetence of federal law enforcement in general, it doesn't really take much imagination to see that this is going to end up nowhere good. And in fact, it did. As I say, the practice began under George W. Bush, but was uncovered under President Barack Obama. And that's really where, a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today happened.
Yeah, well, one interesting thing to say there, and I think pretty much everybody in my audience, I know I even have like a somewhat of a split with a left-wing audience because I mostly talk about anti-war stuff. We'll, have an agreement that the ATF is a pretty evil organization, but, this isn't what's portrayed in the mainstream. I remember watching an article of, I think it was, or not an article, an episode of NCIS years and years ago where, they heroically stop, some drug traffickers from getting weapons to, I believe, terrorists with the ATF in this like secret like thing where they allowed the guns to be trafficked, but almost all of them didn't have firing pins in them, and they were able to, trick the bad guys. So was there any great like tracking program here, or were the guns just going to Mexico and going straight to the cartels where they would shoot people up with them?
Well, okay, so it's difficult to say because what we know about this is still limited to what, the ATF has released and Congress has been able to dig up and then release. So I think it's always kind of, anytime you're talking about information that we're getting from the federal government, there should be a big asterisk placed next to it that like, this is what we know based on, what they have allowed us to see. So the kind of, gist that you would get from what happened is that they weren't, that there wasn't very effective tracking of these guns, and where there was so much looking the other way because they're waiting on the big fish to catch on the line that, there's not, that even where it was effective, it wasn't, there wasn't a lot of enforcement of the kind that the ATF talks about when they're trying to justify, these programs. And I don't necessarily think that, the death of a U.S. Border Patrol agent is any more tragic than the death of anybody else. But that was the thing that got people's attention about it. Was it got so bad that, one of these weapons was used to potentially kill a United States Border Patrol agent. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that they were not able to definitively tie the weapon that Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was shot and killed with to Fast and Furious, but there were 4 suspects arrested and two AKs found near the scene were traced back to Operation Fast and Furious, meaning that, it's entirely in the scope of possibility. But even if it wasn't like the actual weapon that killed this guy, it was in the hands of the crew who killed him. So used in that firefight, almost certainly. And again, like, I don't want to get all like weepy about law enforcement officers being some kind of special protected class that we should be especially outraged about their deaths. But I do think that it's a very telling indictment of this program that they weren't even able to kind of keep their own guys safe. And I also think that it's very telling about, the sort of like clannish and tribal nature of federal law enforcement, that like, I don't want to go so far as to say like ATF doesn't care if U.S. Border Patrol agents die, because I don't think that's the case. And I don't really have like that cynical of a view of federal law enforcement as individual human beings. But I do think that, it was not, at least at the top levels of how this thing was planned, the priority is never the individuals. It's always the kind of grander goal or the grander strategy, which, as we see, they weren't even good at executing that.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like the death of Brian Terry was something like Jamal Khashoggi's situation with Yemen, where, all the poor, brown people dying in Mexico are really, really victims of this program that's going on, just like the people of Yemen are dying. But, you had the death of Jamal Khashoggi, who was a Washington Post journalist. And so that was a lightning rod that the media and people could get behind. And, kind of likewise, Brian Terry, that's, enough of a sympathetic and single figure that makes a really big news story and headline. So I guess that's why it blows the top on these programs. But it's just interesting how, kind of the U.S. federal policy gets away with committing all these crimes. And it's only when somebody from one of these special classes, Washington Post journalist, or, a U.S. federal law enforcement agency gets killed, then do people suddenly care.
Well, that was kind of the thing that I ran up against when I was, doing this, was, okay, so a U.S. Border Patrol agent died. How many other people died? And the number is, I'm trying to look for the actual number, but the short version is it's a lot. It's a lot of people were shot and or killed because of this gun walking practice. So again, like, I don't want to go too far either into the, let's be weepy over law enforcement officers, or the who cares he's a cop camp, because I do consider both of those to be really extreme and not, where I'm at personally. But I think that what you're saying is very on the money. Is there's this very, there's a lot of fixation on the death of the U.S. Border Patrol agent, which I do think is as tragic as the rest of the deaths. But yeah, like, what about the rest of them? And it's quite a bit. and I'm trying to get like a number just to lay on your listeners here. I mean, it was over 2,000 weapons purchased through straw buyers. 389 of those were recovered in the United States. 276 were recovered in Mexico. And the rest of them are like God knows where. And also, there's the thing I talked about earlier where, they're involved in X number of crimes, both in the United States and Mexico, ... that we know about, that we know about. This is just places where they're, in June 2010, at the end of the operation, the ATF knew about 300 weapons being found at crime scenes, over 300, 179 in Mexico, 130 in the United States. That doesn't include guns that weren't found at crime scenes that are still in the possession of hardened criminals. That doesn't include, pick your kind of way to couch this. Like, it doesn't include a lot is kind of the point. And I think it's not really, I think that one of the kind of strange things about it to me is that I do think in a certain sense this is kind of, standard operating procedure for federal law enforcement to kind of have one foot in the field of creating these problems and one foot in the field of, solving them. And it's almost like, a mob boss giving you protection. But, in any event, yeah, lots of people were hurt whose names we don't know because they're not, U.S. Border Patrol agents.
Right. And then another one of these guns, or a gun that was sold from one of the stores, involved in this, was found in Paris in 2015 after a terror attack. Is that's right?
Yeah. I mean, this is like, to me, like, this is the hook for me, honestly. There were a number of coordinated attacks by Islamists in Paris in 2015. The most famous of those is the attack on the Eagles of Death Metal concert at the Bataclan, which, I'm not like, it's not like because I'm into the band, but this poor guy who is in this band who kind of is like, what the hell? Why is no one raising a stink about this? And then he kind of gets, canceled by the rock community. I mean, I don't even remember his name. That's how little I know about this band. But it struck a chord with a lot of people in the West because you can picture yourself, it has a more specificity than I was walking across London Bridge and I got stabbed. It's like the Ariana Grande concert or whatever. It's got this more kind of like, it's got something that you can kind of emotionally tether yourself to. But yeah, like they've tracked weapons to that coordinated series of attacks. So again, this thing that we're supposed to trust the federal government to kind of partially or temporarily, in air quotes, suspend our rights so that they can, again, in air quotes, protect us. And they're not, real good at it. And I do actually, I'm sure that many of your listeners will not agree with me, but I do actually think that it's primarily incompetence. That it's part of it is like I said, this sort of mob boss phenomenon. Part of it is this kind of tribal nature of federal law enforcement. They all like to silo off intelligence from each other, which may actually be a good thing because the less they know, the better. But I think that a big part of it is just the kind of Keystone Cops incompetence of it all. That, we're just going to let guns walk, and because we're the omnipotent ATF, we're going to be able to follow them everywhere we go and prevent. And if the goal is not to prevent things like mass shootings by Islamist terrorists happening, what is the goal? Like, why do we have an ATF if they can't prevent something like that?
Right. And, as you're saying this, it just sounds to me a lot like the U.S. policy in Syria where, we're willing to give guns to people that, and then we knew those guns were going to the Islamists and, just like we know these guns are going to the cartels. And In one of the early episodes of the show, I had Brian Sadie on, and he talked to me about how brutal and how ruthless and the homicide rates and the murders that go on in Mexico. I mean, it's really crazy that, these are some of the most disgusting people on the planet. These aren't inner city American gangs where, at worst, 9 people die in a weekend in Chicago. We're talking about shootouts. I've read stories about entire towns pretty much being wiped out by these cartels and gangs and stuff like that. So I don't know. I could see to somebody who doesn't know like the history of the ATF and Ruby Ridge, which maybe we should move on to next. But how do you explain, just giving working machine guns to, nut jobs who will massacre innocent people?
You don't is the short answer. I mean, and that's the thing too, is like, one of these weapons that they let go. I mean, I laugh because it's like, it is absurd on its face that this organization that, supposedly is meant to protect us from, evil gun runners, is basically running guns to organize crime. But, one of the, there were a number, and the thing is, there's a number of like cases that, I mean, I would bet that like the average, educated and well read in terms of keeping up with the news and getting in depth with the news, Mexican knows more about this than anybody probably, because they were used in a number of really high profile crimes in Mexico. There's one where, they had a 50 cal that they were shooting at a police helicopter with. A Mexican beauty queen was murdered with one of the weapons that was gun walked. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who've been hurt and killed by this. And again, like you bring up Ruby Ridge, I mean, they certainly didn't let the sawed-off shotgun that they entrapped Randy Weaver into making for them walk. I think that it cuts across the questions of incompetence in federal law enforcement. I think it cuts across questions of, what their actual mission statement is. It's very disturbing.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Ruby Ridge a little bit here, and where that all starts off with Randy Weaver being entrapped. And I know, with the ATF, for a not very old organization, the history is just absolutely one of complete, failure after another, especially when you look at, Waco and, Oklahoma City and, their possible, nefarious things going on there. But, just to kind of focus on Ruby Ridge, tell us how that all starts off and then what blunder by the ATF leads to this standoff between Weavers and the federal police.
Well, Ruby Ridge, I think, is something that a lot of your listeners of a certain age are probably familiar with. I think that younger listeners maybe are less familiar with it. But so what happened in Ruby Ridge was there was this guy, Randy Weaver, who's had some kind of weird religious beliefs, and as a result moved his family to Idaho, where he was kind of hanging out with members of the Aryan nations, but no one claims he was a member. And I also think that it's important to point out that, Randy Weaver's beliefs are not on trial. I don't think that Randy Weaver's beliefs are important. I don't think that it's necessary to either endorse them or to kind of constantly be like, poo-pooing them as if you need to distance yourself from whatever his beliefs may be, which people can look up on their own. I don't think that they're at all material to what happened to Randy Weaver. And I think that it's very important to point that out, that somebody's rights and liberty and physical safety are not kind of subject to a public veto on whether or not their beliefs are acceptable. So Randy Weaver was being investigated by federal law enforcement because they were trying to figure out if he was working with the Aryan nations. As it later turned out, most of the Aryan nations leadership were cops, which is not going to be that surprising probably to any of your listeners, that they were either informants or, actual cops. So what happened is that Randy Weaver was entrapped into selling a sawed-off shotgun to a guy. Randy Weaver had not been selling sawed-off shotguns. He basically got pestered by this guy who was like, saw this shotgun off for me, points to where he wants it sawed off, and then sells it to, Randy sells it to this guy. They knew Randy was having a lot of financial difficulty. I think part of it was around property taxes, which wouldn't surprise me, but in any event, I don't recall specifically why they were having money troubles. But they owned the land. He had a ranch, which is always going to be referred to as a compound, because a compound is just, a ranch that's gotten in trouble with the feds. And so they were going to, put him on trial for, before the trial, they basically said, now you can be a snitch and you won't go to jail. And he said, no, I'm not doing this. Which I think that is very much to his credit that, he was, and this isn't a guy with nothing to lose either. This is a guy with like kids and a family. So I think that's really speaks to Randy Weaver's character as an individual, that he refused to do that. And so then they said, okay, well, we're going to, they let it go for a little while, and they said, okay, well, we're going to prosecute you for it. And there was some kind of bureaucratic snafu with his court date. And so he didn't show up, and then they were going after him for failure to appear. And he, unsurprisingly had kind of been becoming increasingly, I'm just going to use the word paranoid, though I don't necessarily think that it's the best word, because, are you paranoid if people are actually out to get you kind of thing? But in any event, Randy Weaver didn't show up for his court date. They tried to give him another court date for failure to appear, and he was just like, no, I'm not coming off of my ranch now because you guys are going to kill me, or just railroad me or whatever. So the marshals go to serve a warrant and aren't in uniform and don't announce themselves. And Randy Weaver's son and like this guy who, if memory serves, was kind of a drifter who like was taken in by the Weavers, and kind of became a part of the family. Randy's 14-year-old son and this guy who was, I think, like, he wasn't that old. He may have been a teenager himself. They get into a shootout with the ATF that involves 14-year-old Sammy Weaver being shot and killed. And of course, just wouldn't be the federal government if they didn't shoot and kill a dog. So of course the dog gets shot and killed. And then this leads to this giant standoff, on the ranch, the ranch of Ruby Ridge. Vicky Weaver, Randy's wife, is shot through a door and killed while holding their infant child. And they're kind of holed up there for a while. And they eventually come out. Randy and the family friend, are put on trial and are acquitted of everything except failure to appear in the case of Randy. And the guy who shot and killed Vicky Weaver is an FBI sniper named Lon Horiuchi. I'm sure I'm butchering his last name, but I don't care. That guy has fallen off the map. He shot and killed somebody else that I don't remember who, but that's kind of the short version of what happened, which wasn't very short, but in any event.
Yeah, no, thank you for that summary. And in either of these cases, was the ATF really held, or the Justice Department held responsible, for the murder of the Weavers, or the murder of any of the hundreds of probably Mexicans that have been killed by this?
Well, the thing with Fast and Furious was, Congress did actually go after people in Fast and Furious up to and including Eric Holder pretty hard, if you look into it. But they were stonewalled the whole way, and this is what ultimately led to Eric Holder becoming the first, I believe he was the first sitting cabinet member to be held in contempt of Congress. So yeah, that's like, they didn't really, and there was eventually some kind of court settlement regarding that. So I don't think that it's entirely fair to say that there was no repercussions, but certainly, no one, like if you or I messed something up at our jobs that didn't result in somebody's death, we would probably not have jobs anymore. But this being the federal government, it's not terribly easy to lose your job. And Obama and Holder go way back. So Obama was, very much in his corner during this whole thing. It was the first time Barack Obama ever invoked executive privilege, was to protect Eric Holder from congressional investigations. Ruby Ridge, there was not a lot. There was blowback, but it was all kind of bureaucratic slap on the wrist stuff. No one really got busted down except for this FBI sniper who, like, God only knows where this guy is, because he was very much a target. He was very much a target of the the gun show circuit at that time. And I don't necessarily mean that, I think that there was some kind of organized conspiracy to kill him or anything, but I believe that he probably had, very good reason to fear for his life, especially, well, this was after Waco, but yeah, I mean, I think he was involved in Waco in some way. So I think that I would bet money that this guy is in some kind of, protection right now, because there's nothing about him. You can't find anything about this guy after about 1999. Which is, that's 20 years ago. This guy's fallen off the map completely. But yeah, for the most part, it was all just kind of, bureaucratic, slap on the wrist. Bob Barr, or Bill Barr, was very much involved in, covering things up for people. And actually, this was before Waco. I'm sorry, again, my dates mixed up. But yeah, there was, the wagons were circled, and there was kind of some, rough language from within Congress, but no one was really held to account for it. I mean, this isn't like surprising to anybody. Of course they weren't.
Well, over at ammo.com, I think you guys are working to undo some of the damage that's done by the ATF. Do you want to talk a little bit about your project over there? Because I think it's kind of unique, and I think I know some more conservative listeners that would love to hear this stuff.
Well, so what we're actually going to be doing a history of the ATF in January, which I'm really looking forward to working on. Yeah, I mean, we have the Resistance Library, where we have variously talked about, the TSA and the things that the ATF have been involved in, civil asset forfeiture, for-profit prisons. There's really quite a bit of stuff on there in terms of breadth, but I'm really looking forward to diving in to the history of the ATF. And one of the interesting things about the ATF is that kind of since Fast and Furious, it's a bit of an orphan agency. Like it doesn't have its budget increased, or hasn't for a few years. And what that means is it's an effective budget cut, because there's built-in, pay rises and increases in rent and things like this. And they're not even getting like an administrative cost of living adjustment, if you will, in terms of what they're budgeted by the federal government every year. And, the kind of like, mainstream liberal, the kind of mainstream liberal critique of the Trump administration with this is that, he's kind of trying to throttle and choke off the ATF. I don't think that that's true, but I do think that the ATF has become a bit of a third rail in the federal government and the federal budget, not entirely because of Fast and Furious, but I think that Fast and Furious was kind of the thing where it became too hot for, like who's the constituency for give more money to the ATF, I guess is what I'm saying. There kind of isn't one. People either don't know who they are or they hate them. There's no one who's kind of like rah-rah ATF and the way that people, it's one of the strangest things to me of the last few years is how, liberals now think that the CIA and the FBI is like these awesome crusaders for democracy in the United States. But no, the ATF doesn't have any cheerleaders anywhere. I would guess that, there's kind of a handful of them who have branch offices in their district in the Congress. But I can't even say that with any kind of certainty. So yeah, they're a weird kind of orphaned agency, and I would not be surprised if in the next, 5 to 10, they're shuffled around and kind of have their duties either it's through some kind of rebranding where they become get a new agency and have a different set of duties, or they're just kind of shunted underneath some other group. That wouldn't surprise me. But the things that we know about them, are not good. They have, very high profile scandals in a way that, say, I don't even know. I mean, I don't want to say the FBI because, they're not quite as, let's say the Secret Service, the Secret Service, if I say hey, name a Secret Service scandal without resorting to Google, 999 out of 1,000 people have no idea. But if I say, hey, name a big ATF scandal, again, it's not like average Joe on the street is going to go, oh, Fast and Furious. But if you and I stand on a street corner in Amarillo, Texas, and start asking people to name an ATF scandal, we're going to get somebody who's going to say Fast and Furious before lunchtime. And I think that is one of the more telling things about the ATF is that, their scandals are so grotesque that they occupy a place in public imagination that other agencies don't have comparable scandals.
Right. Well, yeah, I guess this is interesting where the right might not be quite so interested in the ATF because they like their guns. And I would not be surprised at all. If when I was in New Hampshire, at least, if I had gone down the street corner and asked, what's an ATF scandal? If I had found somebody by lunchtime that not only knew all about Fast and Furious, but also went on a rant about Waco and Ruby Ridge and possibly Oklahoma City too, because, those are the kind of stories that right-wing gun people really do care about. And, that is, threatens their gun rights and stuff like that. But then, the left doesn't care about this. And I guess it's great that they don't care about the ATF. And man, this must be one of the worst federal police forces ever. If they can't even drum up, rah, go American support post 9/11, cause it seems like just about every other agency has been, managed to do that. It's quite something to see.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of it. Just think about that. The ATF doesn't get their budget increased. That was the thing that I read that just kind of said it all to me. Wow, they're not getting budget increases. Doesn't every agency just get a budget increase, to keep up with inflation? No, not the ATF. The ATF doesn't.
Right. Well, look at all the U.S. wars being a failure and everything. And that, for all those, the Pentagon and everything, that means more money every year. But, it's great to see that. And hopefully, like you say, we will get rid of the ATF at some point. And I hope, that, history you're putting together at ammo.com ends up being one of, the nails in the coffin of the ATF. Do you have anything else to plug or add? And thanks so much for coming on to talk about the ATF.
Well, if your listeners are looking for a discount on their ammunition, they should go to ammo.com/podcast. It's also pretty easy to find the resistance library from there. And I'll send you, some links for you to throw in your show notes that I think will be of relevance to anyone who enjoyed this.
All right, everybody. That's Sam Jacobs of ammo.com. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.